name's Josh Hughes. I'm a partner at specialist personal injury firm Burdon, Kemp, based here in London. For the last decade or so, I've specialised in acting for those who've sustained life-changing injuries. And whilst that's the core of what I do day to day, it's also really important that we're feeding into the discussion on industry-wide topics such as the emergence of e-scooters. I think it's particularly important to hear as many perspectives as possible on this topic before the legalisation of e-scooters happens. So the aim of today is to bring in as many stakeholders as possible to get outside of that echo chamber that we can often find ourselves in and understand what needs to be in place before that legalisation happens. If you could introduce yourselves one by one, starting with Jonathan Fong.
Great, thank you very much. My name is Jonathan Fong. I am a Senior Policy Advisor at the Association of British Insurers. ABI is a trade association with 200 plus members representing the insurance and the long-term savings sector. I am the Motor Policy Advisor at the ABI, and my interest in e-scooters stems from the fact that I oversee our portfolio of future transport, a part of that being new forms of mobility such as micromobility. We've worked really hard with the government to start assessing what the options are and potentially what the insurance options are. But at its core, we're most concerned about road safety and creating a proper regulatory framework to bring these devices to our streets.
Good afternoon. I'm Sergeant Steve Wilson from the Metropolitan Police's Road Transport and Policing Command. I run the cycle safety team, which now encompasses e-scooters and micromobility methods of transport, and we work as part of the Mayor's Vision Zero plan to reduce the number of killed and seriously injured people on London's roads to zero by 2041.
My name is Ben Pepper. I'm an associate solicitor in the complex injury team at Burdon, Kemp. I specialise in high-value road traffic accident claims on behalf of claimants. I'm also APIL's coordinator for their special interest group on transport. As a claimant solicitor, I've seen a steep rise in the number of cases in recent times, both in terms of e-scooter riders who've been knocked off their e-scooters by other motorists, and also in pedestrians who have been injured by e-scooter riders. Of all the inquiries I've had, they've all consisted of privately owned e-scooters. And for us at Burdon Kemp, if e-scooters are legalised, it's very important that injured people have the ability to access compensation when collisions occur through no fault of their own.
Good afternoon, I'm Margaret Winchcombe. I work for the Parliamentary Advisory Council for Transport Safety, commonly known as PACTS, and I led a project funded by the Road Safety Trust from May last year, and we were working on three things. One, to collect casualty data, because it was evident that although the government trials were collecting information about rental e-scooters, there was no information about private e-scooters. Secondly, to collect evidence about how e-scooters could be made safe for use on public roads. And finally, to prepare recommendations for the government. Now we know rather than should, but will when regulations are put together for a new law to make them legal on streets.
Hello, my name's Alex Glassbrook. I'm a barrister at Temple Garden Chambers in London, specialising in road transport law. I'm a writer on advanced automated and electric vehicle law, and I'm a teacher as a visiting fellow at the Centre for Transport Studies at Imperial College London.
I'm Paul Yagmorian. I'm the Public Affairs Officer for the Motor Insurers Bureau, the MIB. We're the UK Guarantee Fund, and we step in to compensate third-party victims of accidents when there's no insurance involved. Either the driver of the vehicle is uninsured or it's a hit-and-run accident. And I'm responsible for the MIB's agreements with the UK government and the government of 4 other territories for which we act as Guarantee Fund. And our interest in e-scooters is to know whether there will be a compulsory insurance requirement, and if so, in what capacity we might be able to sit behind that as the Guarantee Fund.
Hello there, I'm Graham Trotgill, Executive Director at the British Insurance Brokers Association, BIBA. I'm a former general insurance broker, and I've run our motor committee at BIBA for 21 years. We support micromobility. We've written it into our manifesto for the last 3 years about e-scooters being legalised. Nevertheless, people are being injured, increasingly so. I think it's 26 people a week at the moment. So we do think that there needs to be agreed standards of construction and a robust regulatory framework. And we think that part of that regulatory framework should be some basic insurance requirements to protect the financial interests of the owner, the user, and the third party potentially injured by the scooter. But we do think there need to be affordable insurance requirements. We don't think the government should imply insurance premium tax, because if they want to encourage cleaner, greener, cheap transport, then we think that that should have a waiver. So we're very interested to see what comes forward in the transport bill.
I'd like to start with what I've called the status quo. I certainly think that gives us a baseline anyway. So I want to understand where we are, current status of private e-scooters, what the problems are, and I say the problems because I think, again, general agreement that the current situation isn't particularly satisfactory. Alex, if I can turn to you just from a legal perspective, can you explain what the current situation is in terms of e-scooters, privately owned, used in public?
For today's purpose, probably the key consideration is insurance. And put simply, motor insurance is the way in this country we guarantee that people injured in road traffic accidents receive compensation. In other words, that the judgments that they obtain or agreements they obtain with the sources of their injury result in actual payment to them. Where do e-scooters fit in this? Well, they fit into it in three ways. At the moment, there are a lot of privately owned e-scooters in use around the country. As a matter of fact and law, those are motor vehicles. But privately owned e-scooters aren't permitted for use, save in mandated trial areas, which were set up under regulations in 2020, essentially to test the legality of their use and how they should be regulated. So at the moment, private e-scooters have to be registered, they have to be licensed for use, and they have to be insured, for example. Now, trial e-scooters within the trial areas are liberated from some of those requirements, but as things stand, they still have to be insured, except the insurance is usually provided or has to be provided by the trial operator. A driver's license is also required for use of an e-scooter. Recently, in the Queen's speech on the 10th of May, a transport bill was announced, which has not yet been published, but on the 11th of May, the government spokesperson in the House of Lords, Baroness Vere, said this. She said that the bill will create a low-speed, zero-emission vehicle category that is independent from the cycle and motor vehicle categories. Now, the great unspoken question at the moment is, or rather the unprovided answer, is whether that recategorization, other than as a motor vehicle, which is the phrase used in the section of the Road Traffic Act which requires insurance, the unanswered question is whether e-scooters will have to be subject to compulsory insurance or not.
Thanks very much, Alex, and thank you for dealing with the rental scheme distinction as well, which leads me on to a follow-up question, really, and if I can direct that at Ben, because we have some data based on what the public knowledge of these fairly complex rules are. Ben, if you could elaborate on that, please.
Yes, well, Burdon Kemp, in recent times, we've been running a social media ad campaign through our Facebook and Instagram account, and we've reached over 15,000 users. So it's a very in-depth study with a great deal of useful data, just to get an idea of what the public knowledge is around e-scooters at the moment. The obvious question to ask them was, can a private e-scooter be ridden in a public place, i.e. on the roads or cycle lanes or even the pavement? And categorically, the answer is no. 82% of people got that question right. So 1 in 5 people are still effectively unaware that privately owned e-scooters are illegal to ride in public. So 3,000 people that answered our quiz were wrong in that respect, indicating that perhaps some more education is needed.
Thanks very much. Margaret, I'm interested to know what your research has shown in terms of what's the demographic of people who are using private e-scooters. What purpose are they using them for effectively, and what are the latest stats in terms of their usage?
PACTS is a road safety charity, so we haven't got information about general users. It's in fact proving difficult, I think, even for DFT to carry out full research into private e-scooter users. Instead, we have to find information from picking up the pieces after someone has been in a collision. So from our data, we did find that it was 60% of the people involved in e-scooter casualties in the year 2021 were male. And we found that 50% of those involved in e-scooter collisions in 2021 were below the age of 24.
Ben, under the existing legal framework, how does this all fit, and what does it mean from a claimant perspective when accidents happen?
So at the moment, we're essentially faced with two types of claims on behalf of claimants. So there's the situation where e-scooter riders are injured by other motorists, and that makes up the vast majority of situations. About 75% of accidents involve e-scooter riders being injured, and then the remaining 25% is pedestrians being injured by e-scooters. The cases that I'm currently working on involve e-scooter riders who are riding their own private e-scooters, both to work, both in London. Both suffered life-changing injuries. These cases are still ongoing and haven't yet reached the civil court system. There are other cases within the firm as well. At Burdon Kemp, we have a specialist child brain injury team, and they represent two clients at the moment, two young clients who were knocked down whilst riding privately owned e-scooters, and they both suffered traumatic brain injuries. We've received a response from the defendants in that case, and both of which highlighted the fact that e-scooters were privately owned and unforeseeable, and claimed that it was unforeseeable that an illegal e-scooter would be on the road. This type of illegality defence has been anticipated by us somewhat, and is otherwise known as ex terpa causa, which is a legal doctrine which means that claimants shouldn't benefit from their own illegal acts. But in the case of privately owned e-scooters, if you're a pedestrian injured by a privately owned e-scooter, then in that case the MIB may step in. Okay. But in my view, it's not really a long-term solution. But that's the way things are at the moment.
Segues on to Paul. What's your view on the status quo and MIB being the insurer of last resort in these circumstances?
Well, as others have explained, e-scooters are vehicles, and the MIB, under its agreements, is obliged to compensate in the case of a third-party injury or material damage caused by an uninsured vehicle, uninsured driver. So by its definition, we do compensate, and we do have cases which claims that we are processing as things stand. So our interest is to see how the law will change and what arrangements will be in place when, as Baroness Fear announced, these e-scooters will not be considered vehicles anymore. But we keep quite close to the DFT, but our understanding is that no decisions have been made yet. So it's all under consideration, and we see our role as to be helpful in supporting them in coming to a decision. But we're not taking a position as the MIB on whether there should be insurance or compulsory insurance, and if there is, what form that should take. I think, as Graham indicated, most people are thinking in terms of insurance that would have to be affordable, and almost by definition would stop short of being the full motor third-party liability insurance that motor vehicles, the legal motor vehicles on our roads have to have.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. If I can turn to Jonathan, perhaps, and I mean, what type of injuries and claims are your members seeing most often in terms of e-scooters at the moment?
Yeah, thank you. First and foremost, I'd just like to say that the insurance industry, we want to be a partner in creating a very inclusive, safe, and innovative transport network, and we will continue to do so. However, safety has to come first. For a long time, we have really campaigned for the government to create this regulation. And most importantly, we ask that e-scooter liability should not fall back onto the MIB. In terms of the actual types of injuries we're seeing, I think there are several high-profile cases that we're definitely concerned about. The story of a little girl in Southern Park being hit and suffering life-changing injuries is obviously something that we're keeping a close eye on. But there's also a property element as well. We know that there are evidences of e-scooters catching fire. We're most concerned about e-scooters, both shoddy construction, the ones that can't really handle a pothole, but also the ones that are super high powered and could potentially go 40 miles per hour down the motorway. So overall, we are happy that the government has sort of taken these steps towards regulating micromobility devices, but we will continue to work with them to ensure that that is seen through.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And finally, just finishing up with the status quo question, Sergeant Wilson, if I can turn to you, Steve. What are the barriers police are currently facing in terms of enforcement?
So when it comes to barriers of enforcement, we start with the simple one, is stopping these vehicles. They often operate in the cycle lanes, but at potentially quite high speeds. You are asking an officer potentially who is on foot to step out in front of a motor vehicle that may or not stop. And I can say we've had a number of officers seriously injured because an e-scooter rider has either decided not to or to intentionally ride towards them and hit them at 30, 40 miles an hour, leaving them with years worth of recovery and physio needing to get them back on, if at all, back on the street. So the first one is just stopping them, making sure that they can stop and that we can do so safely. That also poses a risk to the rider because they are a balance-based device, which means if they're going to hit something, they are also going to be knocked off the device, potentially at speed and injure themselves. So whenever we stop a vehicle, we have to also consider not just our own safety, but the safety of the person we are trying to stop. When you factor in criminal elements that will use these devices as a mode of transport, who wouldn't want a fast, untraceable mode of transport if you're involved in crime? It becomes even more difficult. We have to look at the devices that we use to stop vehicles when they fail to stop and see whether the current equipment is actually safe to use on these vehicles. They have much smaller wheels. The wheels are constructed differently. Are they effective? These are tools that were never designed for non-pneumatic tyres of such a small size. Very, very low clearance to the ground. So we have to do a lot of testing to see whether, and if that equipment is not, again, what do we use? We go to the DFT and ask for equipment, and go to the central government, ask for new equipment, go to industry and say, what can you make? You know, we need a tool to stop these if they fail to stop. We've had some low speeds, 20 miles an hour, we've had 40. The fastest device I believe we've seized it was capable of 65 miles an hour. You know, there really is no, at the moment, doesn't seem to be an upper speed. When it comes to the engineering of these devices, it's how fast can you make them go, not, no one is stopping to think about whether you should when it comes to the speed. So the really difficult is predominantly, how do we stop them safely? They will always be attractive to criminal elements because they are fast, they are maneuverable. You slow them down, you can pretty much turn them on the spot. Makes them very difficult for those of us that are in cars or motorbikes to try and turn around. We don't have the same maneuverability. Get onto an estate and disappear very quickly when you are super maneuverable. And then again, education, getting the information up. And then when it comes to the fact that they are illegal, under our statutory powers under section 165A of the Road Traffic Act, we will seize them.
If you're anything like me, as Alex said, a lot of emphasis on the Queen's speech, didn't have much detail, and of course we had Baroness Beer indicate about this new category. So Margaret, if I can start with you, are we expecting a public consultation? Sorry to put you on the spot here. Are we expecting a public consultation on this?
We are expecting a public consultation on this, yes.
Wonderful. Okay, good stuff. And the next question's very much an insurance-based series of questions. Jonathan, Graham and Paul, if we do see this creation of a new independent category of vehicles in the transport bill, what needs to happen from an insurance perspective? Graham, if I can start with you and the brokers, can you tell us a bit about what you're telling government as your kind of preferred option here?
Well, the genie's out of the bottle, so I'd say, you know, they are going to be legalised, and it's our view with anything that the polluter should pay. So if someone's using a scooter, they're injuring someone, you can't expect Paul to dip into the MIB's funds and pay out with no premium coming in. So our view is that there does need to be an insurance consideration, but to keep it affordable, it shouldn't be full Road Traffic Act cover. It needs to be something far more basic, some public liability cover, perhaps £2, maybe £5 million, and that should be consulted on. So we've discussed this at length with our own members, and our members were the ones that were able to arrange the scheme for the rental trials across the UK. So the main considerations that our members have had to make this achievable, to be able to get insurance for these e-scooters are some sort of regulatory framework around where they're allowed to be used, and we're particularly keen that they're not allowed to be used on pavements. The minimum age of use, which because of, I think you can't have a contract if you're a child and have it enforceable, so probably 16 or above, like mopeds. Some sort of basic theory test requirement, like you might have with a driving test these days, not necessarily a full driving test, but just a theory test so you understand the highway code and things like that as well. And then the actual scooters probably need to be identifiable. So if you look at what happens in Germany, they have barcodes and there's a way of tracing them, which helps us process insurance claims as well. So ultimately, we think that the rental scooters and the private scooters need to have the same rules. You can't have, no compulsory insurance component for the rental scooters, but then something for the private scooters. So it needs to be equal. It needs to be measured. It needs to be fair. But we think it's achievable, and we've had members do modelling, and we think it could be affordable if the government listens and cooperates. And of course, a lot of this depends on which scooters are allowed to be used. So with the correct brakes, with the correct power, speed, alerting devices, lights, and then there's things like where you allow pillion passengers, do you have to wear helmets? And helmets is another issue in its own right. There's some stats here. So of the 19,000 cyclists killed or injured in any one year, 40% of them have head injuries, and cycle helmets reduce head injuries by 80%. So that's over 6,000 people could benefit from having a lesser or no head injury if they were to wear a cycle helmet. So we're not saying a motorbike helmet, but a cycle helmet as a requirement would lead to far fewer injuries. So we think that would be good too. And it would encourage more insurer capacity into the market.
Paul, do you have anything to add in that respect, or are you aligned in your views?
Very much aligned. I would like to just add one thought that not everyone might be aware of, is that when the MIB compensates and somebody has life-changing injuries, the compensation quite easily runs into millions, sometimes tens of millions of pounds. So if what Graham outlined is what the government decides to do, there will be a political decision, because if there's a cap on liability insurance of, say, 5 or 7 million, that will not provide adequate cover for most serious cases. And you might be talking about cases of accidents that are caused by e-scooters where actually a motor vehicle has run over somebody, but they've run over somebody because the e-scooter has done something wrong and caused them to do that. So you will, sadly, at some stage, be talking about very, very serious injuries. And I think it's a societal question in a way. I would not like to be the person saying to the third-party victim, sadly in a wheelchair for the rest of their life, well, you can't have adequate compensation because your accident was caused by an e-scooter. Whereas had it been caused by a car, the MIB for personal injury compensates to an unlimited extent. And I've seen many cases where we've compensated. For instance, I think one straight away is £23 million for through life care. The figures easily go into very substantial figures, and I think a lot of people don't realise that. I certainly didn't before I joined the MIB. So I would just like to point out that there are difficult decisions. One way or the other, there will be difficult decisions along the way.
Excellent point, thank you. And Jonathan, finally, from an insurance perspective, are your views, if you're able to say, aligned with the two that we've just heard, or they depart somewhat?
very much aligned because we've worked together on creating those positions. The one thing I will sort of add is that just a bit of additional flavor here. The transport bill, within the transport bill, the government intends to use primary legislation to legalize low-speed, zero-emission vehicles. They will then subsequently use secondary legislation to then create rules and regulation around construction, use, things like insurance for different types of micromobility. So they'll do it for e-scooters, but they're also considering other forms of micromobility as well. The big issue here is we haven't heard enough about what those kind of rules and regulations will be. And until we can get a sense of what the parameters are, what the kind of definition of an e-scooter is, it makes it quite difficult for our members to sort of assess the risk of the vehicle. So it's quite difficult when we have these conversations with government to say, yes, we will be able to provide insurance, or it will cost this much, because we frankly don't know what that risk is going to be. So the big ask that we've always had with government is, let us be a partner in this journey. We would like to see the data from the e-scooter trials to be released early, but we are constantly having conversations with the FT's micromobility team. We've been working together to assess what the international experience has been like, to compare ourselves to what's going on in Germany, as referenced, as well as in France, and just seeing where our system differs. And we're really keen to continue these conversations to eventually arrive at a suitable solution for everybody.
Thank you. Alex, over to you. I'm interested to hear if you've got any particular views on the legalisation of e-scooters and thereafter the insurance policy.
Yes, I'll deal with insurance as this is really a unique occasion to hear all of these views, and I'm fascinated and very grateful for all of the views that have been expressed. But one thing that is relatively constant is that if a vehicle is a motor vehicle, then the benefits of insurance under the Road Traffic Act are there for the third party injured victim. There is a cap on cover, but it relates to property damage. There is, to the best of my knowledge, no cap on personal injury compensation, and there's certainly no cap which applies to personal injury compensation depending upon what sort of vehicle has injured you. And I think Paul is absolutely right to detect the potential for, in the first place, to put it mildly, confusion, and in the second place, injustice to an injured victim who is injured by an e-scooter, whereas if that person had been injured by a moped, they would not be subject to limitation of their compensation. And so while I hear what is being said about what has been referred to as lighter insurance obligation, I think that's the phrase that was used, or a paraphrase of the phrase that was used by the Transport Select Committee. To my mind, it presents, even in a complex area of law, a complexity too far, by which I mean a possible injustice. So I very much echo what Paul has said. Just briefly on Jonathan's point about primary legislation, I think the revision has to be by primary legislation if it's going to happen at all, because compulsory third-party insurance arises under Section 143 onwards, Part 6 of the Road Traffic Act. It is a very well-established remedy in British law ever since the Road Traffic Act 1930. And while we obviously use the word insurance, what I would press upon people is that what we are actually talking about is compensation. Insurance is the means by which we guarantee payment of the compensation.
Alex, just sorry to come in there, because I think you, Ben, you've got an example of just the effect of this and the potential injustice, if you like. I hope you don't mind.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Of course.
I mean, it's from my own experience really, which is a reasonable comparison of a situation where essentially I was representing a pedestrian who was knocked down by an uninsured cyclist. And if we find ourselves in the situation where e-scooters are legalised but insurance isn't mandatory, we could be in the scenario where it becomes very difficult for claimants to establish personal injury claims, because they're claiming against people who don't have the means to pay the damages and pay the costs. And as well as obviously representing my client, I did feel for the defendant, because although he didn't have insurance in place, he was faced with a very hefty bill for damages and costs at the end of the proceedings. So it's just a learning curve really, and I wouldn't want the same to happen to all e-scooter riders across the country as did to that particular cyclist. I'll just finish by just quoting from John McQuater, who's the current April president, from last week's Injury Prevention Week. He said insurance should be compulsory so that when the worst happens, those who are injured are able to gain access to compensation.
So no better place to start, of course, than Margaret and the work that PACS do. Margaret, can you talk us through some of the research undertaken and describe some of the key recommendations that have come out of that?
So we were interested in the safety of private e-scooters over the rental e-scooters. Rental e-scooters have to meet various standards. They tend to be based on the German standards, and they define the construction and also the use of e-scooters. So we were looking at private ones which are defined as motor vehicles but have no regulations to meet apart from those relating to a toy, really, to make sure you don't get your finger trapped when you fold it, for example, and that the battery should be electrically safe as well. So we carried out research collecting casualty data from the UK. It's hard to get numbers of people who are hurt because there is no method for them to be recorded on the Stats 19. That's the police means of recording road vehicle collisions. It's not unusual for e-scooter riders to be using them outside of highways, so there's no obligation for the public to report them, and the police don't have to record them. And of course, if you're using an illegal means of transport, you're unlikely to want to report a collision where you're liable for having to pay a fine, points on your licence, and having your e-scooter confiscated. Nevertheless, there were over 900 incidents that we did record, and that gave us a profile of who was being hurt. So we found 20% of the people were not e-scooter riders. They were other road users, predominantly vulnerable road users, cyclists or pedestrians. We found that 30% were suffering serious injuries, which is higher than the, if you were to look at the road traffic accident data for all road traffic accidents, that's higher. That's about 20% across the board. And that people were suffering head injuries. If they were suffering a serious injury, they were more likely to be suffering head injury as well. And then we looked at academic research, which is increasing, although it was thin on the ground when we started the project, into actually testing e-scooters. So investigating what wheel size is needed for them to travel over potholes, for example. We know that local authorities don't have an obligation to mend a pothole unless it's deeper than 50 millimetres. So that was useful information. And then when they do go over potholes, how stable are they? Does the form of the e-scooter, for example, the deck and the steering column, does that at 90 degrees is a better angle? So we were looking at the construction, and then also looking at interactions with other road users, of course. As the Transport Select Committee said, and as we recommend as well, people should not be riding on pavements. So having gathered that information together, we put together 14 recommendations. And I guess the three key ones to share are from the academic research, predominantly front wheels should be 12 inches or bigger. That because of the serious head injuries, and people do tend to fall from e-scooters in a different way from pedal cycle. There are lots of facial injuries, that helmets should be mandatory and they should be appropriate for an e-scooter. We recommend that, yes, third-party insurance should be included.
Right.
Thank you.
If I can be mischievous for a moment, in terms of this mandatory requirement for a helmet, I suppose if you're a opponent then you would say that has that got the effect, a deterrent effect of e-scooter usage? If it is going to form a bigger part of our transport, mode of transport, what would you say to that?
So the obvious comparison is with pedal cyclists, and if you look from data from Australia or for New Zealand, yes, there was an initial fall in the number of people using those modes of transport, but I'm sure that there are so many other policy agendas working that people's mindset would change and they would see the mode of transport as being safe, as green, and if we are seeing people moving away from a motor vehicle, a PACS report, What Kills Most on the Roads, shows that people are more likely to die in or by a motor car than other means of transport. If you're moving out of that to an e-scooter, well, obviously we're still trying to see how they can be safe, but if they are to be safe, let's work for something that would make them safer than a motor car.
Sure. Steve, do you want to come in on that?
There is a disproportionate number of head injuries when you're involved in an e-scooter. The way you crash, the way you are thrown off the device is different to other modes of transport, and it leads to head and facial injuries. Having done cycle safety for 5 years now, when we see with cyclists, we see a loss of limb. And we know with the advances in prosthetics, replacement limb means you have a full and healthy life. There is no prosthetic brain. Take brain injury, we've seen the insurance cost is substantial. You may never recover. You could be as young, I'm sure we've all seen children as young as 8 or 9 riding these scooters. Do you want an 8 or 9-year-old with a head injury? No one wants that. We can look after ourselves with a helmet. I think part of the problem is we refer to these as cycle helmets, and in fact what they are is low-speed collision helmets. They're not specific to a cycle, they're specific to an amount of speed. It's about 15.5 miles an hour for a cycle helmet. The speed that the trial scooters do kind of goes hand in hand. Vision Zero is at the core of what we do. We want people to go home at the end of the day.
I mean, in terms of all those really sensible recommendations that are made, of course, all of them come at a significant cost. And I suppose the more stringent the construction rules, the higher the cost to the manufacturer, and presumably that will be passed on to the consumer. Ben, given your position as coordinator for April, presumably they've got a position on what needs to happen from a safety perspective.
Yeah, they publicised their position last week and share a great deal of their views with PACS. Certainly the compulsory use of helmets for safety reasons and head injuries being so prevalent. Currently 1 in only 5 e-scooter riders wear a helmet at the moment, so that's a concern. They also believe the minimum age should be 16 to reflect the rules for riding a moped. They feel that riders should have at least a provisional driving licence, and that driving tests for all other motorists should include how to treat e-scooter riders on the road, so how they should pass them, what the passing distances should be, and the rights of way. They also feel that they should be safe and robust. So the things that we were talking about in terms of the wheel size and the positioning of the handlebars, and also the maximum speed of 12.5 miles per hour as well, in line with the rental e-scooter.
So I was going to interject with a third-party question that's been pre-submitted. A chap called David Rose at the Limbless Association, which is a national charity, civilian national charity. He raises concerns about access, particularly for those with mobility restrictions, in terms of e-scooters clogging up pedestrian areas and impeding that journey for those people. How do we reassure the disabled community in that regard? Margaret, is that something you've got anything to add on?
So I can comment, it's not something that we've looked at in detail, but the rental e-scooter trials have contracts which have been set by each local authority. And so the local authorities have the choice to either say e-scooters should be docked. So for example, in London, you'll find there will be marked areas. Often those are actually in the carriageway as well. E-scooters are meant to be moving people out of private motor vehicles, so that's one way of doing it. It also means they're not in the place where pedestrians would be walking. Alternatively, local authorities can have undocked e-scooters where it means they can be literally left anywhere. There is a limit on the geofencing, so although when you leave your e-scooter you're meant to record where it's placed, there's often not much recourse for the rental e-scooter operators to penalise those who have placed their e-scooters unsafely.
Sergeant Wilson, What are the main crimes that you're seeing?
I wouldn't say there's a main crime, but it's a mode of transport that's adopted by criminal networks. So it's not necessarily that this scooter is being used just to commit a crime, but it's used to facilitate crime, the movement of things that shouldn't be moved or difficult, and the difficulties that come with that as well. There is also the road traffic offences that are being committed merely by riding one. You have no insurance, you're not in accordance offences. They are things that, as road transport police, we are obligated to help remove the uninsured vehicles from the road. They pose a danger to people and others. And then we have the traffic offences. Now, not everyone riding an e-scooter commits traffic offences, but they are fast, they are mobile, they pose real difficulty in stopping and catching. So we see a lot of red light infringement and other road traffic offences that go hand in hand. Riding on a footpath, which causes concern to pedestrians. The reality is it's a fast, unregulated, untraceable mode of transport, and identifying them is difficult. There's no license plate, so they all look the same. We do stop them, and we will seize e-scooters in accordance with the law where necessary. Varying numbers. We did start out with a very low-level approach. As I said, we're increasing information and education back in 2019, moving through to 2020, and as we've moved through the time to now, where we have an enforcement, a lot more enforcement. So enforcement for last year was around just under 4,000 scooters were seized. Still a small proportion when you say there's potentially 500,000, but officers have other things to do, can't devote all of our responsibilities and efforts to targeting these, but where they're stopped, they can be seized, taken away. Moving forward, the Met will not be restoring e-scooters to people. We will robustly be requiring the proof of insurance and license, which you can't get, so you can't have it back. So if we are put into a position where we seize it, you will not be getting your device back.
Steve, you touched on an interesting point I wanted to ask you about, in fact, about identification. Yeah. We've had a third-party question being submitted from Ash Medforth, the co-founder of a campaign called Stick a Reg on it. You can guess what that's about, but effectively, if a vulnerable pedestrian is hit by an e-scooter, how do the police go about identifying and holding that person to account if the person is injured without a registration number?
The reality is it's not been a new thing to take a license plate off of a car. You've mentioned already the collision involving a cyclist. That person was obviously identified. A registration plate is not the only method we have, but we're not going to tell you what they are, otherwise we'll see them disappear quite quickly. But we can use a variety of tactics to find out an individual who leaves the scene with very little, but it is harder work. For us, it's also not necessarily about restricting. At the end of the day, we don't know what the safe design is out there. The legislation shouldn't prohibit some better design coming on at a later date. There is information around wheel sizes and construction that needs to be in there in that secondary legislation. And the other thing we would ask is, declassifying it as a motor vehicle can have ramifications on other legislation we use. Drink drive legislation, drug drive legislation requires motor vehicle. If that classification is taken away, are we left with no tools to deal with drink and drug legislation? We just need to make sure that that's still being featured into that discussion, so that if they are accidentally removing other legislation, we get something to replace it with.
So from the MIB's perspective, we could find ourselves in a position where there is a category of, like applies to electrically assisted bikes at the moment, of powered transporters which are not considered to be vehicles, but the ones that do not comply with the restrictions that apply to that category will continue to be vehicles. So, and once the non-vehicle ones are legally on the roads, I think it's going to be a great concern to the MIB that particularly if the legal ones have no kind of identifying marker, number plate or something similar, it will be extremely difficult for the police to enforce the stop the use of the non-legal ones, and those are probably the most likely to cause serious accidents for obvious reasons. And then the MIB will be in the position of compensating. But as Jonathan pointed out, none of us want to be in the position where we're compensating for a class of vehicles where there is no actual insurance income, because what that means for everyone with a normal motor vehicle is that their insurance premium will have to bear the cost of that compensation. So I don't have any answers. I'm just flagging up the concern that may well arise around that situation.
I think what we need is action now. There's over 1 million of these now, as we've just heard, and the number of injuries has more than tripled in a year, and yet we're still, haven't seen the bill. We haven't got a consultation paper out on any of the details that we've discussed today. I think we all agree on so many issues that are going to improve the situation. So why don't we just get on with it? And hopefully, the government can do this sooner rather than later, because it's otherwise, it's going to be an epidemic. We've seen most high streets around the land have e-scooters weaving their way up at full speed amongst the pedestrians, mixing it with them. It's dangerous. There are people injured regularly in the newspapers, 9 killed in the last annual period of the government statistics, and so it's only going to get worse. So we need to get the framework in place now for the vehicle. We need to get it there for the safety and all the rules around insurance and everything else. So it's just, we know they're coming, we know the government want to do it, so just act now.
Absolutely. Alex, can I bring you in on that?
Yes, it was on the exponential growth of imports, which sort of prompts this question. Also, something that Steve referred to earlier on. One might not have expected this power to have been used at the outset, but there is a power under the Road Traffic Act to ban at the point of sale vehicles that are unsafe for road use. Now, obviously, that was not done in the case of e-scooters generically, nor am I arguing for that position. But we do now seem, under the e-scooters regulations, the trial regulations, whose enormous title I won't read again, but they're from 2020. But we do in those regulations have a definition of electric scooter, and one of the provisions is that it can't travel faster than 15.5 miles per hour. I wondered whether anybody knows whether Department for Transport has considered exercising the ban at the point of sale power in relation to certain types of e-scooter, and I'm particularly raised that point in light of Steve's comment, of course true, about innovation of design.
But that won't work, I don't think, because people can just go online and buy it from a Dutch website or a Guernsey website or something, and it will be imported. So you might have a rule on Halfords or something, but with the internet the way that it is, and the number imported, as you said, I don't think that's enough.
But if it's Halfords and Amazon, it would stop a good deal of there must be an importer doing this who can be the object.
We do reach out to individual retailers, and I know the commander for the RTPC did write to them, and Mr. Norman also wrote to all retailers that we could find over the Christmas period, asking to make sure that they were being very, very clear about the legal position. Obviously, they're going to sell what they're going to sell, but made it clear that no one should be able to buy these without knowing that. You're being told that most people will not care, but they should be at least have that information. I know Halfords have a QR code that you can scan. It takes you to the DFT Power Transporters page that makes it very clear.
The answer on ban of a sale is that if there ever was a moment for that, it has passed. Yeah.
I just come in on the scale of this. So Jonathan has explained that they've written to the Minister saying somebody needs to get a grip on the situation that we're in now. So what is that situation? Well, using information of import figures and plotting them from beginning of 2018 through to March this year, the increase actually exceeds the line of the exponential line of best fit. So March this year, we had the largest number of e-scooters imported into the UK since the beginning of 2018. I think recall is over 100,000. I'd have to check on that figure, but overall, the sum under the graph is over 1.35 million private e-scooters that have been imported into the UK.
Wow, that's some figure.
Yes.
It really is.
The one other thing I also want to mention is to zoom out a bit. We've all talked today about low-speed, zero-emission vehicles not being motor vehicles. But as a motor policy advisor, I also need to take a look at how this is actually impacting the vehicles on the roads and other road users. So we're seeing a potential increase, a massive increase of vulnerable road users. And we work really closely with Thatcham Research, which is an insurance-funded vehicle safety organization. And they had done some research taking a look at modern automatic emergency braking systems on modern day vehicles. And they found that certain AEB systems could not respond to an e-scooter. The software was looking for a pedestrian or looking for a cyclist and wasn't able to recognize an e-scooter user. And that means the AEB didn't work and the vehicle ended up colliding into the e-scooter. So I guess it's just a general call for the wider automotive industry to take a look at how we can respond to this kind of changing user profile, and also go beyond e-scooters when we talk about all the different types of vehicles available, the monowheels, the electric skateboards, et cetera, that also needs to be sort of written into that software that's being developed.
Great point. Thank you very much. I'll just come in. From a sensible point of view, any legislation needs to be somewhat future-proof, because as I said, we've got at the moment an e-scooter device, but there's no guarantee what the future holds, and no one wants to be back here trying to discuss another piece of primary legislation because someone's invented another motor that makes it all, something different or something different. So this classification needs to be a little bit more broad than we've done in the past, that we're not have to constantly reinvent the wheel, because technology moves fast.
Thanks very much. That brings us to an end of our stakeholder event. My thanks once more to all of you for making the effort to come along today. I hope you all agree that it's been a really valuable experience, even if we don't leave here today agreeing with one another on absolutely every point. I do hope that this will play a part in the wider discussion ongoing from today. So thank you very much, and goodbye.